When an 8-year-old boy with a terminal illness made a simple request to meet his lifelong hero, Clint Eastwood, his family never expected silence. They sent letters, emails, even pleaded with Hollywood insiders, yet nothing came back. As months passed, hope began to fade. But what they didn't know was that the legendary actor and director had never even seen their messages. And when Clint finally did, he didn't just make a phone call, he didn't just send a message. He did something so unexpected, so cinematic, that it became a story even Hollywood couldn't have scripted. Because in true Clint Eastwood fashion, he turned a dying boy's wish into the most unforgettable moment of his life, one that would change both of them forever. It was a flickering light from the old television screen that cast a soft glow across the living room, the familiar trumpet theme of the good, the bad, and the ugly filling the space. 8-year-old Peter Jones sat curled up on the couch, his frail frame wrapped in a thick blanket, his fingers clutching a toy revolver that had long since lost its shine. Next to him, his father, Michael, watched with a quiet smile, glancing down every so often to see the pure awe in his son's eyes. It was their ritual, weekend Western marathons, just the two of them, escaping into a world of dusty saloons, high noon showdowns, and men who never backed down from a fight. Peter loved it. He loved the drama, the grit, the legends who walked through danger without flinching. But more than anything, he loved one man above the rest, Clint Eastwood. To Peter, Clint wasn't just an actor. He was a symbol of strength, of standing tall no matter what life threw at you. And Peter, more than anyone, needed that kind of inspiration. Diagnosed with a terminal illness, his doctors weren't sure how much time he had left. But that didn't stop him from dreaming. "Dad," he whispered one night, eyes still glued to the screen, "do you think Clint Eastwood would ever talk to me?" Michael felt his throat tighten. He knew his son's world was shrinking. The hospital visits were getting more frequent, the treatments more exhausting. But hope, that was something no doctor could take away. So he made a promise. "I don't know, buddy, but we'll try." And they did. His parents sent letters, emails, messages to fan pages, even handwritten notes addressed to Eastwood's production company. Days passed, then weeks, then months. And still, nothing. Peter's mother, Ann Jones, sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, her phone buzzing with another unanswered call. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. She had spent months trying to reach someone, anyone, who could get Clint Eastwood to notice her son. No response. Not from his manager, not from his agency, not from his publicist. Meanwhile, Peter's condition was getting worse. His once bright eyes grew dull with fatigue, his playful energy replaced by long, silent afternoons spent resting in bed. But even on his weakest days, he still watched Clint Eastwood's films, his little hands gripping the edge of the blanket as he whispered along with his favorite lines. "Go ahead, make my day." Anne couldn't stand it. Her son was slipping away, and the one thing he wanted, a simple meeting with his hero, felt impossible. So she tried something new. She reached out to every Clint Eastwood fan club she could find. She messaged journalists, producers, even Hollywood insiders who might have connections. She shared Peter's story online, hoping someone, anyone, would listen. And finally, someone did. A local news station picked up the story, running a heartfelt segment titled, "A Dying Boy's Final Wish, Will Hollywood Listen?" The clip showed Peter, frail but smiling, talking about his dream, how he didn't want a fancy trip to Disneyland or a pile of gifts. He just wanted to sit down with Clint Eastwood and talk about the movies that made him love storytelling. And then the internet took over. Viewers shared the story, tagging celebrities, influencers, even people connected to the film industry. The message was clear. Someone get this kid his wish before it's too late, but from Clint Eastwood, silence. At least that's what the world thought. Because what no one knew was that Clint hadn't seen the story yet. The letters, the messages, the video. It had never even reached him. And by the time he did see it, it would be too late to ignore. The hospital room was dimly lit, the quiet hum of medical equipment filling the air. Peter lay propped up against a stack of pillows, his small frame swallowed by the oversized blanket. His breathing was slower now, more labored, but his eyes, those were still bright, still filled with the same fire that had kept him going all this time. His older sister Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had watched her parents beg, plead, exhaust every option. And for what? Silence. She wasn't going to sit back and wait any longer. "Peter," she said softly, trying to steady her voice, "I want to make a video. Just you. Just your words. Tell the world why this matters." Peter blinked up at her, his face pale but determined. He nodded. Sarah hit record. The camera focused on Peter's frail body, his small hands clutching the blanket. But his voice, it was strong. "My name is Peter Jones," he began, looking straight into the lens. "I'm 8 years old and I have something called stage 4 neuroblastoma. That means I don't have a lot of time left." Sarah bit her lip, fighting back tears. "My favorite movies are westerns," Peter continued. "I love them because the heroes never give up. Even when the bad guys are bigger, stronger, or faster, they still fight. And no one does that better than Clint Eastwood." He coughed, his body shaking. Sarah instinctively reached out, but Peter held up a hand. He wasn't finished. "Mr. Eastwood, if you see this, I don't want money. I don't want presents. I just want to talk to you before I can't anymore." Sarah stopped recording. For a moment there was silence. Then Peter let out a breath, giving her a small, tired smile. "Think it'll work?" Emily wiped her eyes. "It has to." She uploaded the video, tagging every celebrity, influencer, and news outlet she could think of. And then the internet erupted. Within hours, the video had millions of views. Hashtags like "Maho Clint Call Peter" and "Make Peter's Day" began trending. Celebrities shared the post, urging Clint Eastwood to respond. But from Clint, still nothing. The media storm hit like a wildfire in a dry desert. News anchors played Peter's video on repeat, his soft, hopeful voice echoing in living rooms across the country. Talk show hosts discussed it, radio stations debated it, and the headlines were brutal. Hollywood legend snubs terminally ill fan, too busy for a child, Clint Eastwood under fire, the cowboy who ignored a dying boy's wish. Thousands of comments flooded Clint Eastwood's social media. "This kid just wants a call. Is that too much to ask? Clint, you were our childhood hero. Don't let us down. If you don't answer, you're not the man we thought you were." But Clint, he still hadn't said a word. At first, the silence only fueled the outrage. People speculated why he hadn't responded. Some assumed he didn't care. Others thought he was just another out-of-touch celebrity, too busy with his own life to acknowledge a sick child. Then came the conspiracy theories. What if Clint never saw the video? What if his team is keeping it from him? Does anyone even know where Clint Eastwood is right now? The pressure kept building, and the longer he stayed silent, the worse it got. And then one night, a paparazzi photo surfaced, a blurry image of Clint Eastwood leaving a private golf course, looking relaxed and unbothered. The internet exploded. "He has time to play golf but not call a dying kid." The backlash was reaching its peak. People were furious, calling for Clint to make a statement, to explain himself. But what no one realized was that Clint hadn't ignored Peter at all. He hadn't even seen the video. Not yet. But once he did, everything would change. The sun had barely begun to set over Carmel by the Sea when Clint Eastwood set down his golf club and wiped his brow. It had been a quiet afternoon, just the way he liked it. No cameras, no crowds, just the open course and the steady rhythm of the game. He had no idea that at that very moment, his name was being dragged through the mud across every news outlet in the country. It wasn't until he returned to his office that evening that he noticed something was off. His assistant, Daniel, stood stiffly by his desk, eyes darting toward Clint's computer screen, where hundreds of emails sat unread, each one with the subject line screaming Peter Jones's name. Clint furrowed his brow. "What's all this?" Daniel hesitated. "Sir, there's something you should see." He pulled out his phone and played the now viral video. Clint watched in silence as a frail little boy stared into the camera, his voice soft but full of conviction. "My favorite movies are westerns. I love them because the heroes never give up, and no one does that better than Clint Eastwood." Clint's jaw tightened. His fingers curled into his palms as the boy's plea continued. "Mr. Eastwood, if you see this, I don't want money. I don't want presents. I just want to talk to you before I can't anymore." The video ended, but the weight of it hung in the room like a storm cloud. Clint exhaled slowly, setting the phone down. How long has this been going on? His voice was low, measured, but anyone who knew Clint well could hear the shift in his tone, the quiet, dangerous kind of anger. Daniel swallowed hard. A while, sir. A few months, actually. I didn't think it was important. You get thousands of fan requests every year, and I figured... Clint's eyes snapped up, sharp and unwavering. You figured wrong. The room fell into silence. Clint glanced back at the screen, scrolling through article after article, headline after headline. The world thought he had ignored this boy. The world thought he didn't care. And for the first time in a long time, Clint felt something that didn't come easily to him. Regret. He stood abruptly, grabbing his jacket. Call the family. Get me on the phone with them tonight. Daniel hesitated. And if they don't pick up? Clint's voice was firm. Then we keep calling until they do. Because this wasn't just another fan request anymore. This was a boy's last chance, and Clint wasn't about to let it slip away. Ann Jones's hands shook as she stared at the caller ID on her phone. She had spent months trying to reach Clint Eastwood. She had written letters, emails, even begged reporters to get his attention. And now at nearly midnight, her phone was ringing with a number she didn't recognize. But the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Mrs. Jones, Clint said, his tone steady but gentle. This is Clint Eastwood. Ann nearly dropped the phone. Oh my God, Mr. Eastwood, She couldn't even form words. Clint didn't waste time. He apologized personally, sincerely. He explained that he had never seen the letters, never gotten the messages, that it was never his intention to ignore Peter. And then he said the words that made Ann's breath catch in her throat. I want to come see him. For a moment, there was only silence. Ann covered her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. She turned to her husband, who had been listening in on speakerphone. Michael's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. Are you serious? As serious as I've ever been. Ann swallowed the lump in her throat. Peter. He doesn't have much time left, Mr. Eastwood. We don't know how long. Then I won't waste a second. And Clint meant it. Within hours. His team had made all the arrangements. He chartered a private plane to Peter's hometown, cutting through every layer of red tape standing in his way. But Clint wasn't coming empty-handed. There was one more surprise, and as he boarded the plane, he carried a small, leather-bound notebook, his personal script notes from some of his greatest films, and inside a handwritten letter addressed to Peter. Because Clint wasn't just planning to meet the boy, he was about to give him the moment of a lifetime. The hospital hallways were quiet, the hum of machines and the occasional murmur of nurses filling the air. Inside room 214, Peter Jones lay in bed, his frail body barely visible beneath the soft blankets. His skin was pale, his energy low, but his eyes still held the spark of a fighter. And then the door creaked open. At first, Peter didn't look up. He was used to doctors and nurses coming in and out. But when a familiar, gravelly voice filled the room, his breath caught in his throat. I hear you've got a thing for Westerns, kid. Peter's head snapped up, and there he was, Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, standing just a few feet away, his hands resting casually in his pockets. That same legendary presence that had dominated movie screens for decades now filling the tiny hospital room. For a long moment, Peter just stared, unable to speak. His lips parted, his breath shallow, his heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. His hero was standing in front of him. Ann let out a small gasp, covering her mouth, tears spilling over her cheeks. Michael gripped the edge of the hospital chair as if grounding himself to reality. This was happening. Clint walked over and lowered himself into the chair beside Peter's bed. Gently, he took the boy's tiny, weak hand in his own, giving it a firm but warm squeeze. You all right there, partner? He asked, his blue eyes soft with understanding. Peter finally blinked, then let out a shaky breath. You're real, Clint chuckled. So they tell me. That broke the tension. Peter grinned, his face lighting up like it hadn't in weeks. And then the question started. Despite his exhaustion, Peter leaned forward, eyes gleaming. What was it like filming The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly? Did you really do your own stunts in Unforgiven? Is it true that you never blink when you aim a gun? Clint laughed, shaking his head. That last one's a pure Hollywood myth. For the next few hours, he sat by Peter's side, answering every question, telling stories from his career, even sharing behind-the-scenes secrets that no one else knew. And then, with a mischievous glint in his eye, Clint leaned in. Tell you what, kid. You ever wanted to act in your own Western? Peter's breath caught. More than anything. Clint's smile was slow, knowing. Then we better get you on a set. And just like that, the visit wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The desert sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the hand-built western town. A row of wooden buildings stood tall, a saloon, a sheriff's office, a dusty general store. Horses neighed in the background, their tails flicking lazily in the warm breeze. And in the middle of it all, dressed in a miniature cowboy outfit complete with boots, spurs, and a hat 2 sizes too big, stood Peter Jones. For the first time in months, he wasn't just a kid in a hospital bed, he was a cowboy. Clint had spared no expense. He had called in his old set designers, brought in stunt coordinators, even had a small film crew ready to capture the moment. This wasn't just about making Peter's wish come true. This was about giving him his own legend. Clint stood beside Peter, adjusting the kid's hat before stepping back with a nod of approval. All right, partner. You ready for your big scene? Peter swallowed, his heart pounding against his ribcage. Are you serious? Like, actually serious? Clint's expression didn't waver. Dead serious. And just like that, the cameras rolled. Peter, playing the role of the brave young sheriff, stood tall in the middle of the street, facing down an outlaw played by none other than Clint Eastwood himself. You got a lot of nerve coming back to this town, Peter said, his voice steady despite his excitement. Clint, dressed in a dust-covered duster, narrowed his eyes. I go where I please, kid. The camera zoomed in on Peter's hand as it hovered over his toy holster. The tension built. Even the crew held their breath. Then Peter pulled first. His little plastic revolver clicked as he aimed straight at Clint. For a moment there was silence. Then Clint staggered backward, clutching his chest in mock agony before dropping to the ground with a dramatic grunt. The entire set erupted in cheers. Peter beamed, his smile stretching so wide it hurt his cheeks. His mother sobbed into Michael's shoulder, watching their son, their fighter, live his dream. And Clint, he just laid there in the dirt, peeking one eye open. Not bad, kid, he murmured. Not bad at all. But this wasn't just about the scene. This was about giving Peter something to hold on to, a moment that belonged to him, one that he could take with him no matter what came next. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clint Eastwood realized something. Peter wasn't just acting in a Western, he was writing his own story. And Clint was honored to be a part of it. The world had watched in anger and frustration when Clint Eastwood remained silent. Now it was watching in awe. Within hours of Peter's once-in-a-lifetime Western adventure, the footage went viral. Clips of Peter dressed as a sheriff, facing off against Clint in an old-fashioned duel, flooded social media. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines like Clint Eastwood grants dying boy in the most unforgettable way. From a hospital bed to the Wild West, Peter Jones's final ride. The day a cowboy became a legend. Millions of people watched as Peter stood tall, his tiny hands gripping a toy revolver, squaring off with the Hollywood icon himself. But it wasn't just about the video. It was about what it meant for Peter. It was everything. His body was growing weaker, his energy fading by the day, but his spirit was stronger than ever. He'd watch the video over and over, showing it to his nurses, smiling every time Clint dramatically collapsed in the dirt. One night, as his mother tucked him in, Peter whispered, "Mom, do you think they'll remember me?" Sarah choked back tears, brushing a hand over his forehead. "They already do, sweetheart." And Clint, he wasn't done yet. The experience had changed him too. He had gone into that hospital room thinking he was just making a kid's wish come true. But Peter had given him something just as valuable, a reminder of why stories matter, why kindness matters. So Clint did what he always did when something mattered. He took action. 1 month later, he launched the Peter Jones Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to making dreams come true for terminally ill children. Every kid deserves a chance to live their own adventure, Clint said at the launch event. His voice steady but thick with emotion. The world listened. Donations poured in from all over the country. Celebrities, filmmakers, and everyday people wanted to be a part of it. And just like that, Peter Jones, a little boy from a small town who had dreamed of meeting his hero, was leaving behind a legacy far bigger than anyone could have imagined. But even as the foundation grew, even as Peter's story touched millions, one thing remained certain. Time was running out. And everyone, including Clint, knew it. The air was still that morning. No wind, no movement, just a quiet, unspoken heaviness that settled over the small church in Peter's hometown. A black cowboy hat rested on the last seat in the back row, and beneath it sat Clint Eastwood. He hadn't wanted attention. This wasn't about him, it never had been. So he stood quietly, hat in hand, head slightly bowed, listening as friends and family told stories about a boy who never stopped dreaming. Sarah and Michael spoke last. Their voices trembled, but their words carried strength. Peter didn't just love Westerns because of the action, Michael said, glancing at the crowd. He loved them because they taught him what it meant to be brave, to stand tall no matter what. And thanks to Mr. Eastwood, he got to live that story. Sarah placed a hand over her heart, tears shimmering in her eyes. Our son may not be with us anymore, but his spirit lives on. And it's because of all of you. Her gaze drifted to the back of the room, locking onto Clint. A small, knowing smile, a silent thank you. Clint simply nodded, tipping his hat slightly. No words were needed. He had done what he came to do. After the service, he stood outside, watching as people hugged, whispered their condolences, held on to each other. And then, without a word, he turned and walked toward his car. But he didn't drive straight home. Instead, he took a detour. One final ride for Peter. A secluded ranch just outside of town, where the open plains stretch far and wide, untouched by time. Clint saddled up a strong, dark stallion, swinging onto the horse with the ease of a man who had done it his whole life. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, he rode into the distance. Not for a movie, not for an audience, but for a boy who had reminded him why this mattered. A boy who had lived his own Western, a boy who had left a mark on the world. Peter's story wasn't just about a wish. It was about the power of kindness, the power of storytelling, the power of one small act that can change everything. Because in the end, Clint Eastwood hadn't just given Peter a dream, Peter had given him one too. And as Clint disappeared into the sunset, his silhouette blending into the golden light, the message was clear. Every act of kindness can change a life. Be someone's hero today. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even crazier.